Hello, everyone, and welcome to Wisdom Works Live. I'm Gracie, and today I'll be moderating the session. I'm really glad you're here for this important conversation. Today's webinar is about understanding neurodiversity in adults, an area that's often misunderstood or overlooked. Neurodiversity reminds us that the way people think, process information, and navigate daily life varies naturally, yet many adults spend years feeling out of place simply because their needs were never recognized. So, in this session, we'll explore what adult neurodiversity really looks like, how to identify key indicators, and we'll explore what adult neurodiversity how we can build environments at home, work, and in our communities that are more supportive, informed, and genuinely inclusive. I'm also very excited to welcome our speaker, Dr. Anamika Vajpayee. Dr. Anamika is a highly respected clinical psychologist with over 22 years of experience in Dubai. She's the founder of Anawell and also serves as a senior psychologist at both OpenMinds Center for Psychiatry, Counseling, and Neuroscience and Keyani Wellness. I'm so glad she's here with us today and to shed light on this important topic. So, just a quick reminder before we begin, please keep your microphones muted during the session, and if you have any questions, drop them in the chat. We'll address them during the Q&A at the end. With that, I'm delighted to begin the session, starting with some of the key areas that people are most curious about. So first, Dr. Anamika, could you please walk us through what adult ADHD really actually looks like?
Hi, Parishi. Thank you for inviting me on your podcast. I'm quite happy that young generation is talking about neurodiversity, so kudos on that. Adult ADHD. So ADHD is ADHD. It's made of two main criteria: attention deficit and hyperactivity. Right? These are two main criteria on basis of which one diagnoses ADHD. Now, adult ADHD also happens in the same way. There's hyperactivity, impulsivity. But what's unique about adult ADHD is it continues beyond childhood, right? And because many adults learn to mask their symptoms really well, it remains undiagnosed. They're high functioning, they're able to carry on with their day-to-day chores. Sometimes they even excel in what they're doing. And so, though they feel that something is amiss, they're not really able to understand that this is a neurodevelopmental condition, which is why it remains undiagnosed for that long. Should I talk about adult autism too?
Yeah, so most people only hear about ADHD in children. So how does it show up in adults?
So in adults, it would show as inability to focus, inability to finish the chores on time. Even when they're not doing something, the mind is racing. It's as if they're on edge all the time. There would be difficulty starting high value projects, which requires a lot of thinking, requires a lot of focus. They would try to procrastinate, or on the other hand, if they're masking it well, they would be very, very organized, very structured, but inside they would know that there is something that I'm finding difficult to cope, because their attention will keep wavering between task to task. So adult ADHD would project slightly different in adults, because hyperactivity is not physical. Hyperactivity is mental. It's not seen by eyes. So they usually, sometimes it is, but usually they would talk excessively. They will have difficulty in waiting. They might show a lot of physical agitation. That also happens sometimes. But the question that you asked was, why is it hidden? Is because this restlessness, impulsivity is more mental.
All right. And building on that, could you also explain what adult autism looks like? Because a lot of adults don't realize that the autistic profile can be very different from the childhood stereotypes that we grew up hearing about.
Right. So adults with first of all, we have to understand that autism spectrum disorder is a spectrum, which means that a lot of adults that we think have ASD would be high functioning adults, right? They will be people who were able to achieve a lot of things in their life, and they were able to adapt to the needs of the societal norms. Having said that, they would also struggle with sensory sensitivity. There will be difficulty understanding social cues, so that what we call social intuition is missing. There's a lot of rigidity. The communication patterns would be kind of different, atypical. So a person talking to them would be perhaps finding a bit of gap in the communication, the way they're responding or processing information. Um, Again, remember what I said earlier, that they might be masking a lot of these symptoms, right? So, for instance, if they're feeling a lot of sensory sensitivity as adults, they might wear dark glasses when they're going out, when there's a lot of bright light, or they might want to quieten the noise by putting AirPods or earplugs, even sometimes. So, they have learned how to cope, right? But the symptoms have not gone away. They will never go away, actually. But we can learn to manage these symptoms. So they would have still difficulty talking outside an unstructured conversation. They will have a need for routine. They will have like strong, special, typical interests in certain things. They will have rigidity in thinking, right? Many of them even complain about like a social burnout, when they are out in public for too long, they feel that it's kind of overwhelming for them, right? You might find such people preparing a lot for conversations, presentations, and so on. And usually after social communication or public appearance, they would feel exhausted, they will withdraw, and they would like to be very quiet and by themselves for some time. Yeah.
Yep. So for someone who might be wondering about themselves or someone close to them, what are some core symptoms or indicators of adult ADHD or adult autism that people should be aware of, do you think?
Let me read out certain stats first so that we know what is the problem, and I'll come to the symptoms. So almost 5% of adults globally have ADHD, and 70% of adults with ADHD have not received a diagnosis in childhood. That's how big this problem is, right? Whereas in terms of autism spectrum disorder, almost 1 to 2% people worldwide live with this disorder. Women living with this particular disorder are very high maskers because they're slightly more emotionally intelligent, and that's why sometimes it leads to misdiagnosis or even missed diagnosis. And so it creates a lot of issues later on in their life with anxiety, depression, burnout, etc. Now, what are the symptoms? How do we know that somebody has ADHD? Is that they will have inattentiveness, right? So they will have difficulty in sustaining focus. They will forget a lot of things, not like the typical forgetness that people have. It would be atypical. They would forget a lot of things during the day. Their time management would be very poor. They will lose a lot of items, like leaving things here and there, not remembering to bring it back. They would find difficulty in completing the task that they have started, especially if the task requires a lot of focus and attention. So you would see these adults, like for instance, they are opening the Outlook and checking emails. They would respond to emails which are quick and simple, and they will keep the emails which require them to think through and focus for later, right? So work piles up quite a lot with such people, and they feel mental fatigue faster than other adults. So after a while, they'll be like, I'm done. I can't deal with this anymore. And as I said earlier, the hyperactivity and impulsivity is there, but it's often masked. So you will sense a certain restlessness around these individuals, like as if they're not settled. You would also notice that they often interrupt others. So they'll not let the other person complete what they are saying. They would like to interrupt. Uh, they might also report that they feel that they're always on a go. They cannot calm down. They cannot settle. They feel even when they finish the work, right, during the day, they would feel that there's still a need for their mind to keep racing. So they're not able to calm themselves easily. And you would find that they talk excessively. They will continuously be saying something or asking something. As I said earlier, waiting for their turns is very difficult for them. Another very important thing that we have seen in these adults is their executive functioning is also impaired sometimes. They will quickly feel emotional overwhelm, even in situations where they should have controlled their emotion. They would, they show their emotion sometimes. They often rely on others in the team for their planning and organization, right? And given a chance, they would procrastinate or hyperfocus quite a lot. So that's how an adult ADHD looks like. Now, remember what I said earlier, it's a spectrum. People would be high functioning, so maybe sometimes it's even masked. A person would know, but they would not show. Now, when we come to adult autism spectrum disorder, The core symptom of autism spectrum disorder is communication differences, right? So they will have difficulty in reading social cues. Like if you are sarcastically smiling, they might interpret it as a smile. They will not be able to differentiate between different kinds of smile, right? Another thing that happens with them is uh, they interpret what is being said to them literally, right? So they will not be able to read it in between the lines or look at culturally adapted sentences, right? So they look confused sometimes when people are talking to them, because if it's not very literal, they are kind of lost in that conversation. And they also find unstructured small talks difficult. So you would usually find such people sitting quietly because they cannot just engage in talks, right? So that's why sometimes they are interpreted as introverts instead of people understanding that they might be on the ASD spectrum. Then, in terms of behavioral symptoms, you will see they have an intense need for routine. They would want everything as they have structured. They cannot tolerate any changes easily. Sensory sensitivity is seen over here also quite a lot. And another very unique aspect of ASD is they will have some sort of special interest in something and they can hyper focus on that thing. Like, for instance, somebody is interested in music, so they would know everything about music or a particular singer. Or if somebody is interested into biking, then they would know all about bikes and which make and which tire and which year and everything about it. So they have that ability. But that can also lead to rigidity in thinking, that they will not be able to quickly adapt to the changes as is expected in adult working environments, right? So they would be able to do one thing at a time, but whatever they're doing, they will do very well, right? Social burnout would happen because they cannot be around people for quite some time. Masking happens. As I said earlier, it's more common in women. So they will copy the social behavior and they will come across as typical, but inside they're feeling very uncomfortable and they would like to leave. And they would over prepare for conversations. They would want to practice things. They would spend a lot of time in practicing, say, PowerPoint presentations or interviews or those kind of things, because they find unstructured social conversations very hectic and very tiresome, right? And exhaustion is seen in many of them. Social exhaustion, not wanting to go in public too much. These are some symptoms of adult autism spectrum disorder.
Right. And on a related note, what are some of the more commonly missed early signs of ADHD in adults? And also, how can someone distinguish ADHD from simply just stress, anxiety, or burnout?
Okay, stress, anxiety, and burnout would be contextual and temporary, right? It would happen once in a while when stuff is not in control. They would experience the symptoms I just told you in many settings over the period of time. So it's not new. So it won't be like one day. So a person is very communicative, very chirpy, very talkative, and one day suddenly they became quiet and they have developed autism spectrum disorder. It doesn't happen like that. They've always been like that, and they knew, the person would know that, I am not able to adapt to this particular situation, but because of social pressure they learn how to mask it, both in ADHD as well as in autism spectrum disorder.
Right. Thank you. Also, another big question that many people have is about diagnosis. So, how are these conditions actually diagnosed in adults, and what does that assessment process look like from a clinical perspective?
Okay, so adult ADHD is diagnosed through certain psychometric tests. So initially, there would be a clinical interview when a person would go to a psychologist or a psychometrician. They would look at the childhood history. They would look at how they behave. There would be certain questionnaires. In certain cases, there's also neuropsychological testing that is done. In OpenMinds, there is such technology available. And in addition to that, then there are certain self-report tests, the tools that we use. There's a very common one, which is ASRS1, ASRS2, which is used quite a lot. Then Connor's adult ADHD rating scale is used. Barclay's adult ADHD rating scale is used. So there are many such kind of rating scales which are applied with a person. And in addition to, there's DIVA clinical interview, which can be used to diagnose a person. Usually we triangulate the information. So we'll take information from at least 2 or 3 sources, and then we will put it together, triangulate the information that we have received, and then we'll make a diagnosis. So it's not like just like that we will say that this person has inattention or this person has ADHD. Another thing that I forgot to mention about ADHD is it could be primarily inattentive kind as well. So there's no hyperactivity available, applicable. There's only inattention that one would see in a client, or vice versa. There's no inattention but only hyperactivity. So that also we will rule out when we are doing the diagnostic tests. Regarding the ASD, again, we'll do something similar. For autism spectrum disorder, we look at the developmental history. Sometimes we might even want to parent to be present for the interview so that they can give the inputs. But usually because it's adult, there's no need because they themselves can say quite a lot. Behavioral observation is used. One can make out when they're talking whether they're making eye contact or not, whether they are able to take the social cues or not, how they are structuring their sentences, etc. Right? And then we do a sensory profile. Other than that, there are certain psychometric tests that we would use. Like for instance, ADOS-2 is a gold standard test, which is most commonly used. Other than that, there are also CAT-Q, ADIR. Like there are many other kinds of tests that we would use. Again, what test we are going to use will also depend from person to person. It will differ. So when we meet with a client, that kind of helps us understand what kind of test would be required for this particular client, right? So again, same thing. We will take the data sources, at least 2 or 3 data sources, and then we'll triangulate what we have collected. On basis of that, then the diagnosis is made. Now, to make a diagnosis, we usually would go for either APA standards or WHO standards to meet the criteria, and only then the diagnosis is made, right? So it's a very complicated process through which the diagnosis is made. But the reason for this being such a detailed process is so that we do not misdiagnose the people, right?
Right. And there's also this pattern we see where a lot of people only get diagnosed later on in life. So why does that happen? And what are some of the reasons that adults go undiagnosed for so long?
So I'll give you an example. Like many times, girls having ADHD are very good at masking it, right? They mask their symptoms very well. And that's why many times they are not diagnosed. And only when they are adults, they would actually feel that there's something atypical about them, because one would compare their behavior with others, right? In the similar setting. And that's when a client would come to me and say, I think there's something on about me. I cannot focus. I cannot rest. I'm always on a go. And I feel I'm different than others. I've always felt like that, but now I think it's a high time that I would come and ask somebody. And that's when you look at the academic performance, it's very high. They have been, high achievers. So that all is masking their actual issue. And when you start doing the tests, you start doing the interviews, they're like, it's like an aha moment for them. And they're like, yes, 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 I have this, I have this, I have this, So it's quite empowering for a person because now they know what is going on. Right. Also, what happens sometimes ADHD is misdiagnosed as anxiety or even depression because a person is starting to withdraw or they come across as anxious. Their expressions are misunderstood. Right. So in 80s, 90s, 2000s, the awareness was very, very little, which is now changing, thankfully. But because of that, also a lot of adults, they develop the compensatory behaviors to hide their symptoms so that they can be accepted by the society.
Right. And once someone does get a diagnosis, what does the support typically look like? Like, what are some of the treatment or management options available for adults? It could be therapeutic, medical, or lifestyle based.
Okay, so when it comes to intervention, usually it's a team effort. So the psychiatrists make the diagnosis usually, and then the case is referred to the clinical psychologist. We study the case together. We decide on what kind of pharmacotherapy or medication is required. There are 2 kinds usually for ADHD, like for instance, is stimulant and non-stimulant medication. So we decide which one is required. In addition, which is the most important part, is the psychotherapy. So we would use different modalities, like for instance, cognitive and behavior therapy is very, very effective for ADHD. Executive functioning coaching could be required because many of these adults are in workspaces. So how do they adapt to the workspaces? In fact, if a person puts their head to it, they can actually turn this into a superpower, right? Because at the end of the day, it's a trait. And that trait could be either interpreted as a failure or interpreted as a superpower that you have, and a person can actually do wonders with it. I know a lot of highly successful people who are living with ADHD, and they have taken treatments. They've come to the clinic. We have done like a lot of executive coaching together, and it has improved their performance significantly at workplace because now they can actually harness this particular trait in an effective way. Now, apart from that, there could be emotionally regulation that is required. So for that, we would do emotional regulation therapy or emotionally focused therapy. So EFT is used. Other than that, sometimes we use mindfulness-based intervention where we kind of teach the person how to calm down in this chaos that is going on in their mind. And so, over the period of time, a lot of breath work, a lot of meditational techniques, and so on are also taught to the person. So it's like a multi-tier approach where you are trying to focus on the problem from many, many different angles. Even lifestyle, like for instance, sleep hygiene of people living with ADHD is extremely poor. So you might work on that. We might want to bring like a more structured schedule, structured routine, right? Because they benefit from it. They're not able to do it by themselves. So that could also become a part of therapy. If similarly, like for autism spectrum disorder, we might do the same thing. Medication usually is not given with this particular disorder as an adult, but we do a lot of CBT. We do social communication therapy where we teach the client how to communicate more effectively, how to read the sensory signals, how to regulate their own sensory overload that they are feeling. So there's something called sensory integration therapy which is used with them. We also use a lot of like role play situations where we apply a bit of psychodrama based approach to help the person understand how to understand the social cues. Similar to ADHD, then emotional regulation strategies could be used where the person is able to then find out how to best regulate their emotions. um, then sometimes we do like social interventions also in the environment, right? So, what are sensory friendly environments? How can they choose their environment strategically? How can they predict their routines to some extent? How can they reduce the social overload? So, we'll teach them these tricks and techniques because, again, they're adults, they're at workplace, so they have to learn how to adapt to so many different personalities. So, as I said earlier, with ADHD, with ASD, also a range of different therapies are used. It's usually a team effort. If need be, occupational therapy can also be used to help the clients who are slightly on the higher side of ASD. Yeah.
Right. I completely agree with what you said earlier. It can definitely be turned into a superpower. And I know this gets overlooked sometimes, but what strengths do you normally see most often in adults with ADHD or autism?
So let me give you a case history. Of course, it's confidential, so I will be changing some details to hide the actual information about the client. So I had this client come to my clinic once, and initially he thought he has ADHD. So he kept saying that, I can't focus. I feel very nervous in board meetings. And he was at a very senior level in his organization and is very successful person. And we began to talk about ADHD. And after a while, he was like, I don't think I have ADHD. Because, when I was talking about the symptoms and criterias and so on, because always my sessions start with psychoeducation. What is it? When you say you have ADHD, does it feel like this? And he was like, no, I don't think I have ADHD after what you've told me. So then I began to dig deeper, like what are the issues you're facing? So he said, I cannot do small talks. I feel so overwhelmed when people are continuously talking. Even in board meetings, I get so irritated when people are deviating from the topic. I want to stick to the topic, finish the meeting. I hate unnecessary emails. I don't do social dinners and so on, so on. And after a while, I'm like, this is sounding more like adult autism spectrum disorder more than ADHD, right? So I gave him a scale and said, okay, I didn't tell him what it is about. I said, I would like to rule out something. And let me give you a test if you're okay with it. He said, we fixed another session. He came in, did the test together. I did some behavioral cues. Then we did a clinical interview. Eventually, I told him, listen, I think you have this autism spectrum disorder. And I gave him like all the criteria of it. And you should have seen his face. It kind of, when a person feels understood, it's such a joy. They feel it. Yes, this is what it is. And then for a bit, he was a bit sad. He said, oh, I didn't even know I had this. And I was like, yeah, a lot of people don't know they have it because nobody cared to get them diagnosed. And they might never have discussed this with anyone. Now that you have discussed this, perhaps you now understand what you have. But consider this a privilege because now that you know, you can do so much about it, right? You can bring interventions in your life. You can take therapy. You can take coaching. And so he did. And at the end of it, he was doing so much more better at workplace. He already was quite successful, but he began to enjoy his success more. He began to enjoy his workspace more. Another case, this lady comes to me and she comes to me with a diagnosis in her mind. Again, she had seen some video on YouTube or Instagram or somewhere. She said, you know what, I have ADHD. I was like, okay, what makes you think like that? I said, I get very distracted. I can't focus. I get fatigued. So I said, okay, was this happening always? He said, no, it just started like 3-4 months back. And that's not how ADHD is. It doesn't, come to a person overnight. Like it's not a virus that one develops overnight. So after my clinical interview, I had doubt that this person does not have ADHD. Again, we did scales and some of the criteria matched. It showed a bit of a trace. But again, that's why we triangulate the data. When I was triangulating the data, it was not adding up. And eventually what we figured out was the person doesn't have ADHD, but he's displaying some of the symptoms of ADHD because he recently got promoted to a very high position. And this promotion threw him off guard. He was not prepared for it. And suddenly there was extreme amount of work, which he was not able to deal with. So he was finding other strategies to cope up with this extreme anxiety that he was feeling. So eventually he was diagnosed with anxiety disorder. And we did a mix of CBT and executive coaching. And he was completely recovered, which doesn't happen with ADHD, right? It's not temporary. So why I'm saying this on your podcast is because I want people to understand that just watching a YouTube video or reading some news is not enough to diagnose yourself. There's a particular strategy, technique, specialization required to be able to do so. So please reach out to mental health professionals if you're suspecting anything. There's no harm in that. Now more and more insurances cover this kind of assessment and psychotherapy. So it's just a matter of picking up the phone, dialing a number, and meeting a specialist. I'm available at Keyani Wellness Center and OpenMinds at Bersha. So if any of your listeners would like to get themselves assessed or just come and meet for a session, they're more than welcome to do so. I'll share the number of both the clinics with you so that you can put it in the description box.
Thank you so much for sharing those real life examples. It gives so much depth to what we've been discussing. And finally, moving on to a more broader question. What are some of the biggest misconceptions about adult ADHD and autism that you wish more people understood?
So because these are usually suspected as disorders of children, as adults, the biggest misconception is thinking that this does not carry on in adulthood or that adults don't have it. It's just that adults might have not been diagnosed with it when they were younger because there was lack of awareness or there were limited resources or whatever. But it's very commonly seen in adults. Though, as I said earlier, adults learn to mask it better and they are able to be successful despite it.
Right, I think that's all from me. Thank you so much, Dr. Anamika. We really appreciate the time and depth that you brought to the session. And I know that your guidance will genuinely help people understand themselves and the adults in their lives in a more supportive way. So thank you for sharing your expertise with us so generously today. So let's open it up for Q&A. So could you please type your questions in the chat, and I'll go ahead and start with one of mine. So what are some small changes that you think workplaces can make immediately that genuinely help neurodivergent adults feel supported?
Oh, yeah. So there's something called ergonomics. Most of the workplaces do not have ergonomically friendly environment, which means the lighting, the noise level, etc., is not regulated at all. Nobody looks into it usually. So keeping the lighting slightly dim, like if I'm sure you would have noticed, you're a school student. Do you like the lighting in your school, or do you find it too bright?
No, a lot of people actually complain about that. It's a bit harsh and too bright.
Right? Most of such institutions have really bright lighting, and somebody who is already overstimulated sensorily will find it very difficult to work with that lighting, right? So perhaps giving options where people can dim the light, and now there is technology, there is that kind of lighting available, would be very, very useful. And then a noise level. People living with neurodiversity are not very they find it difficult to be in very noisy environments. So sometimes workplaces tend to be extremely noisy and busy. One common thing that we can do at workplace is keep the noise levels regulated. um, Thirdly, I would say that we expect everybody to be an extroverted person, talk a lot, express all their emotions. Not everybody is extroverted. There's a whole range between introversion and extroversion, and people lie at different levels of it. So be kind to people who do not want to talk too much. Do not ostracize them. Do not label them. Just because they're not talking too much does not mean that they're not very capable people. So don't overlook them. So it then kind of boils down to inclusion, right? We are all different kinds of people. All are different, but not less, right? And that's what I want the workplaces to understand, universities to understand, so that everybody can find their space nice and happily in this whole environment.
Thank you so much. A great question that came up from the chat was, could you explain why unmasking can feel emotionally heavy or destabilizing for adults?
Because they've learned to adapt through masking, right? We discuss masking and what kind of masking people do. They hide behind those masks, and that's how they've learned. That's their defense mechanism. You take away somebody's defense mechanism, but doesn't give them the tools, then that person is not going to be, very comfortable in their situation.
Right, thank you. Also, another great question that came up in the chat was, how does ADHD affect personal relationships and communications?
Which social relationships?
Yeah, social and personal relationships.
ADHD.
Yeah.
Okay. So it's mainly because a person might not be able to focus and attend to what the other person is saying, because their mind is all over the place. They're thinking of 10 different things at the same time. Now, bear in mind, I'm talking about people who have not taken therapy. Once people are into therapy, they take executive coaching, it becomes better. Then actually they become very good at multitasking. But usually a person with ADHD, when they're having a conversation, they cannot focus for that long. So they would be on their phone constantly. They would be, their eyes would waver somewhere else. And that's giving very negative social cues, right? Because the person in front of them is interpreting this as, oh, they don't care, they don't love me, they don't like me, and so on and so forth, right? So that disrupts the relationship because the cues are misunderstood, and also because the person might not actually be paying attention, and so the other person feels unheard and invalidated, in certain ways.
Thank you so much, Dr. Anamika. I think that was all the questions that we got from the chat. So that was such an enriching session, and I think your perspective on adult neurodiversity gave us so much to think about around recognizing the signs that we often miss, understanding the actual lived experiences of neurodivergent adults, and also creating spaces where people actually feel seen and respected and supported. So we're really grateful that you took the time to share your expertise with us today. So with that, I think we'll wrap up today's session. So thanks to everyone who joined, and a special thank you again to Dr. Anamika, who for not only sharing your perspective, but also answering our questions so thoughtfully. So we'll see you next time. If you'd like to attend more webinars like this, please make sure to sign up for our upcoming sessions. And I hope to see you next time. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, everyone.